I'd like to introduce Dr. Jerry Bergman. Actually, I recently interviewed him as well on my channel. Thank you for that. And Dr. Bergman, he's one of the 10 most educated people in the world per the amount of college credit hours he has, which is 1,026 college credit hours, which would be the equivalent of about 20 master's degrees. He has over 1,400 scientific publications, author of over 50 books. He's a member of Mensa. And so anybody who says Christians aren't educated and don't know what they're talking about, well, Dr. Bergman is living proof that that is a false statement. But without further ado, welcome Dr. Jerry Bergman. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I have a lot of stuff here ready to cover, so if I end up talking too long, which I probably will, then just cut me off. No problem. But what got me interested in this is this book here called How I Changed My Mind About Evolution. And this was about 30 people who were young earth creationists and all became evolutionists as a result of being convinced that evolution was true. And I wondered what evidence they had. Well, I read through the whole book and I found almost no evidence except they believed in evolution because most scientists do believe in evolution, and therefore that's why they accepted it. And a lot of interesting discussions there. One thing they stressed is, does it really matter whether we were created by God or whether God used evolution to create us? That's a common claim that they use. Well, it is in many ways, and I'll show you one way. A book done by Michael Roos, excellent book, called Darwinism as Religion. And it shows in many ways that Darwinism is a religion. Why? Well, because a religion really are worldviews. And there's two primarily worldviews. One is creation, the other is evolution. Creation says God created us for what purpose? To live, I can talk here, to live on the earth, to do his will. What's the afterlife? Well, heaven or hell. So basically, a worldview talks about where we came from, why we're here, and where we're going. Evolution answers the same questions. Where did we come from? We evolved. Why are we here? To survive. Where are we going? When we die, and that's it. And one thing I thought about as I was reading this book was, well, looking at the other aspect of the question, and that is the harm that evolution has done in society. And it's enormous. That's an area I've specialized in for a lot of reasons. One very strong reason is that's my background is in history, sociology, psychology. And it's clear that Darwin ideas have done enormous amount of harm in society. And there are many, many books, papers that document this. And I could show you a few, and there are many. One I just came up with recently was Hitler's last secretary. Traudl Junge was Hitler's secretary, and she made some very interesting statements about Adolf Hitler and where he got his ideas from. And she said, by the way, she was probably closer to Hitler than any other person in 3 or 4 years. And so she knew him very, very well. And she was largely unaware of what was happening in World War II. But all she saw was a good side of Hitler. So in this book, she talks about what did Hitler believe? What was his worldview? And she says here, Hitler had some very clear ideas about where we came from. Okay? Hitler was not a member of any church, she says. He thought that Christian religion was outdated. Why? Because they did not accept evolution. Although she didn't use the word evolution in this term, this is not Hitler's words, this is her words. She didn't use the word evolution, but it's pretty clear. She says, the laws of nature were his religion. Well, that's evolution. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. He could reconcile his dogma of loving your neighbor and your enemy very difficult. You couldn't do that. Okay. Science, he says, isn't clear about certain things. See, not clear about certain things, but we know a great deal about the higher stage of development of some mammal, which developed, from some reptiles and moved on to human beings by way of the apes. So in essence, we start out we're reptiles, we become mammals, and then we, by way of the apes, becomes human. Very clear what he is referring to. And she continues with her discussion of what Hitler believed. We are a part of creation and children of nature, and the same law applies to us as it does to all living creatures. And in nature, the law of the struggle for survival has reigned from the first. Everything incapable of life, everything weak, is eliminated. Only the strong survive. Those who are not fit do not survive. And so, very clear. In fact, when you read Mein Kampf, which I've tried to read, it's very hard to read, I find. But when you read Mein Kampf, you realize that so much of what he said is almost word for word of what Darwin said. Now, obviously, Hitler never read Darwin's books in the original. But we know that Hitler basically got his ideas from Ernst Haeckel and other scientists, and we know they got their ideas primarily from Charles Darwin. So the ideas started with Darwin and moved on to other scientists, eventually into Germany, and eventually they spread throughout the academic community in Germany, and this is where Hitler picked up a lot of his ideas. It's not very well known, but that Hitler, when he was in prison for attempting to overthrow the government in Germany, when he was in prison, he got tutored by two professors, very well known. In fact, one of them was a very well known professor. And he often said, I got a free college education in prison, courtesy of the state. And a lot of his ideas, in fact, Mein Kampf, came from this imprisonment that Hitler experienced. A lot of the ideas came from professors who we know had a very strong familiarity with Hitler's works and Darwin's works and his ideas. Now, one reason I like to look into this area is because there really is no controversy. There simply is no controversy. It is well documented in history. There are many, many books which cover this in detail, and just a few of them I happen to have in front of me. I had more, but I don't have room in my study here to keep them. But this one by John Hornick, Why the Holocaust? And this is subtitles, Hitler's Darwinistic Messianic Genocide. Very, very well documented. He's a Czech scientist, very well documented, showing indeed that Hitler's ideas came directly from, through several sources, Charles Darwin. And again, this has, I have to admit, I haven't read this one yet, but this is one I'm working on. Almost 400 pages documenting in detail the relationship between Adolf Hitler and Charles Darwin. And then there are many others, Hitler's religion, the twisted beliefs that drove the Third Reich. And again, this talks about the importance of Darwin. And then Darwinian racism, again, talking about the importance of Darwinian racist ideas in the Holocaust and in Hitler's philosophy. And one other one, Hitler's ethic, about how important Hitler's ethic was. Now, when we talk about ethic, we're not talking about Christian ethics or our ethics. We're talking about, in this case, Hitler's ethics. And Hitler had very clear ethics, but the ethics were very much in contrast to what we believe about the scriptures and about God and so on. And so his ethic was survival of the fittest. And what a nation needs to do is produce a superior race. How do you produce a superior race? The main way is, first of all, who are the superior groups, superior races? Well, that's the Aryans. And the Aryans would include not only the Germans, but also Swedish people, Norwegian, and Brits. He included Brits among that. And he included Americans among that, but Americans, there's so much interracial marriage that he wasn't too optimistic about the evolution of the superior race in America. So you know now who is the superior race? They're the Aryans. And this, by the way, was widely believed by scientists in his day. And in fact, during the Nuremberg trials, one of the main arguments that they used is, look, why do you sit here and condemn us? We relied heavily upon American scientists, American writings, American ideas, and we can show you where we got our ideas from. So you're blaming us for the Holocaust when the foundation was laid by your scientists as well as the British and later on, of course, the German scientists. And our response to that is, yes, that's true. But one difference is you carried the Holocaust far beyond what we did. We identified in American eugenics work, we identified the inferior races, we wrote about it, but we did not advocate, did not support building concentration camps and killing the inferior races. Hitler thought, and the Nazis thought, in the long run, in the end, the world will honor us, will glorify us, because what we have done, as Himmler said, is very difficult, very difficult. But in the end, we will have created a superior race. How do you do that? Number one, you encourage the superior race people to have kids, big families. In fact, Hitler even went to the point of giving awards to women who had large families. The Mother's Award is a beautiful award, gold-plated, had gemstones in it. And this award basically was for having a big family. So number one, the superior race produced large families. Number two, you need to prevent interbreeding of the superior race to the inferior race. Get some water here. And how do you do that? Well, you forbid interracial marriage, one way. The other way is, you know, and Hitler knew eventually that the superior race will mix with the inferior race. There's a large number of Jews that had intermarried with Germans, and therefore they had mixed race. So that's a problem. So how do you do that? In the end, in the end, the best way of doing that, get something from my throat here. Okay, that gum for some reason helps because it waters my throat. But anyways, in the end, you have to eliminate the inferior races, so therefore you can produce a superior race. Made that very clear in his writings, as well as, of course, the writings done by many German scientists like Ernst Haeckel, for example, and others. And so the literature is very clear. Now, again, many books only have a page or two about the influence of Darwin on Adolf Hitler, but nonetheless, it's there. And more significant is I have yet to read any book, and I've read probably 300 or 400 books on Nazi Germany. I have yet to read any statement that contradicts this conclusion. It may not be talked about much. In many books, it's not, because the focus is on other things, but it's there briefly, sometimes in more detail. But nonetheless, the importance of Adolf Hitler is clearly, the importance of Darwin on Adolf Hitler is clearly admonished. Now, what is the response when I presented this information to for others? What's the response? Well, the response is, and I'll give you a cliche, in the court they say, if you have the facts, you hammer on the facts. If you have the case, you present the case. If you don't have the facts, if you don't have a case, you condemn the witnesses. You condemn the ideas you're fighting. And over, I've seen they don't prove what I'm saying is wrong. They use name calling or other ways of trying to demean what I'm trying to say. Many examples, but one of my favorite is I did an article on my website on eugenics. And I talked about the harmful effect eugenics had on society. And one of the persons I quoted was Adam Rutherford, who is a British geneticist. And he responded to my discussion not by presenting evidence against what I was saying. Of course, I'm saying the same thing he is when we talk about eugenics, but I tied it to evolution. I pointed out that these beliefs, eugenics beliefs, were an important part of evolution. And he didn't like that. Fine to talk about eugenics, but don't blame it on Darwinism. And so this is what he said, if I can read it here. He said, here, referring to me, here, a creationist for whom deception comes as easily as breathing. I have to admit, he's a good writer. Here, a creationist for whom deception comes as easily as breathing misrepresents, my work on eugenics to draw deceitful, mendacious, spurious conclusions. This man is a foted douche, I guess, canoe. So name calling. And this is, I've seen this over and over. They cannot defend their worldview. They cannot reject what I'm saying. And so therefore they resort to name calling. And so whenever we end up with comment like this, we know that they can't respond to what I'm saying. So therefore they use name calling. Although I have to admit, Adam Rutherford is more creative in his condemnation than some people are. So the evidence is very clear. And going back to the book that I was talking about earlier, one may say, yeah, it doesn't really matter whether or not God created us ex nihilo in the Garden of Eden or whether we evolved. Well, there's a lot of reasons that we can show you that that claim is false. But one is that the harm that evolution has done is clearly enormous. It's unequivocal. It's well documented. And anybody who knows anything about the history of, in this case, Germany, World War II, would recognize that indeed the idea of evolution has had horrendous effects. And not only in Nazi Germany, that's of course the one we talk about the most, but just recently I'm more and more getting into the effect of evolution on the colonization of Africa. And here's one book which does a good job. And this title is Darwin Comes to Africa, Social Darwinism and British Imperialism in Northern Nigeria. And he documents very carefully how critically important Darwinism was in the mistreatment of the natives, in this case, in northern Nigeria. Now, this is not only true in northern Nigeria, but I've done articles on 4 or 5 colonies in Africa that the same thing happened to. Basically, what the belief was is that the Africans, the native Africans, were not as evolved as the whites, and therefore we are a superior race, they are an inferior race, and therefore that justifies putting them into slavery, that justifies exploiting the people, and justifies to the point of, in many cases, of killing them. Because after all, they're not fully human. They're not fully evolved as we are. And that justified a lot of the horrendous things which occurred in Africa. Now, it didn't occur everywhere, but I would say probably more than half of all the African colonies, the ideas of Darwinism clearly, openly affected how the colonists treated the natives. And if you think about it, one who would accept the idea that we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, we're all therefore brothers, and therefore the Africans, they may have different skin color than us, they may live in another part of the earth, but on the other hand, we're all, in the end, brothers, cousins, we're all related. But of course, they didn't have that idea. They rejected Darwinism, they rejected creationism and accepted some Freudian slips here, and they accepted the Darwinian worldview, which says we all evolved. Now, I know some argue, well, yeah, there's one evolutionary branch, but still, even if you believe we evolved from one ancient ancestor, therefore we are all related going way, way back, still, they taught very clearly that indeed we're not only related, but some evolved more than others. And so evolution, even if you accept the idea of monogenesis, which says we're all descendants from some common ancestor, us, all races, but even if you accept that idea, it's still very clear that evolution teaches, as Darwin made clear in his writing, evolution teaches that indeed some races are more superior than other races. there is a evolutionary difference. And so this is one more area where Darwinism had a profound influence on, in this case, in South Africa. And I'm just getting into writing about this area. I could mention that I've probably written 60 or 70 articles on the harm that evolution has done. And it's enormous. And I keep believing, well, I've covered it. I've said all that can be said, and I come up with some new information, and somebody sends me an email and says, wait a minute, you forgot about this. You need to cover this other area. And so I have a feeling I can spend the next 4 or 5 or more years talking about the harm that Darwin has done. But conclusion is, some might think it's rather sweeping, and I hope they think that way because that may motivate people to get into the literature. But by and large, it's very clear that Darwin had an enormous harmful effect on society, an incredibly harmful effect on society. In fact, when you look at evil men, people put Hitler at the top or near to the top. But I would say Darwin is really at the top because Hitler was really one of Darwin's disciples, one of the men who followed him. And of course, not only Hitler, but many others, especially in some of the tragedy that occurred in South Africa, Phil Pot and so on, these other cases, which I've done 4 or 5 articles which show that a lot of these tragedies that occurred in Southeast Asia, in this case, were motivated by Charles Darwin. And so part of it is when you're doing research in some area, you've got to get a niche. You've got to cover something nobody else is covering. And by and large, this, I guess, has become my niche because there's a few people in the past that covered it, but today I'm one of the very few that covers this area. Some creationists are critical of me and say, well, why do you bash evolution? You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't bash evolution. Well, I think the fact it's done a lot of harm is something we need to talk about. And it would not be very fruitful for me to pick up some area that other creationists have already written 30 books about. The flood, Noah's Ark, and so on. It would be foolish for me to try to make a contribution in this area because I haven't been working on this for 30 or 40 years, like some of my colleagues. So I let them do their work, and I hope they let me do my work. I must admit, though, that they're not always very supportive of what I do because some creationists feel that you should not say nasty things about evolution as well. I'm just looking at history. I don't need to come up with any new ideas. It's just reading the books. In fact, really, most of what I've written about is not original with me. I just do a lot of reading, read a lot of books, and try to assemble the information together to produce a summary or a chapter or a whole book on some area of the harm that Darwinism has done. So it's basically history, well documented. So I have to not really brag, but say that creationists tend to be lambasted pretty frequently by our critics. Well, the only thing they can respond to against me is name calling because it's well documented in history and you can't deny history. It's there, and I don't need to rely upon my assumptions. It's just well documented. In fact, there's so many quotes that I could select that would basically illustrate quite effectively, indeed, what Darwin had to say and why and how he influenced so many other people in the last century and caused so much harm and death. One estimate is that Darwinian ideas have caused the death of about 800 million people. And so it's difficult to count bodies because so often, like during the Holocaust, so many of the bodies were destroyed. So we can't really count bodies that have been burned and destroyed pretty much. And so those numbers are iffy, but nonetheless, a huge number of people have lost their lives as a result of the Darwinian worldview. And then, of course, the other aspect I look at is how many people have lost their faith because of the Darwinian worldview. And I've done several books on this, showing indeed that there's a large number of people who have lost their faith because of the acceptance of the belief of Darwinian worldviews. And in this book, they brag that, well, they haven't lost their faith. They became evolutionists and still are faithful Christians. Well, that's might be true among them, but it's not true among many, many people. And the best example of that is before Darwin, 99% of all naturalists, all scientists, all researchers were creationists. And after Darwin, well, today, most studies show about 97, 96, 98% of all scientists are not only evolutionists, but also are atheists. In Great Britain, they recently did a survey among people who were into physics, physicists, and they found 97% were not only accepting of Darwin, but were atheists. And so you can see that the pathway is accepting Darwin, rejecting theism, and accepting atheism. And this is true so effectively among academics as a whole. And now, is there questions I can answer or anything I can respond to? Okay, well, I have plenty of other information. One thing I should mention is that a lot of people think World War II was a war between the Nazis and other countries so the Nazis can gain territory. But really, the major function of the war was not to gain territory, it was to kill the Jews. And a lot of people say, wait a minute, they wanted to conquer territory. That's what people do. That's in Russia, we see that they're conquering territory, which was in their neighboring country. And so they're looking to grow their territory. Well, that was part of it. But on the other hand, there are so many examples which illustrate that indeed the problem was not so much conquering territory, but conquering territory so you can kill the Jews. And one good example is, why did Hitler not continue his war against Great Britain? Why did he just stop and invade Russia? Well, there are several reasons. One is that the British were basically Aryans, so he couldn't understand why they didn't join in with Germany and fight the Jews. Number two, there was not that many Jews in Great Britain. It's a fairly small number, but there was a huge number of Jews, especially in Poland and Russia. There were millions. And so if your goal is to eliminate the inferior races, the Jews, you're far better off spending your time in Russia. And we can see that one of the main things they did was to kill the Jews. And so when they move into an area, the troops would take over an area. One of the first things they did is gather up all the Jews and kill them. And this was in some ways counterproductive because when Hitler moved into certain territories in the Soviet Union, a lot of the people saw Germany as liberators. They welcomed Germany. Good, now we don't have the Soviets to put us through hell. We have the Germans now. Maybe they'll treat us well. Well, they thought that way at first. In fact, you have a lot of motion pictures about the Germans move into a town and the townspeople in Russia cheer. They're happy to see them. But it didn't take long and they started killing the Jews, started killing a lot of the people in that town, and it didn't take long, and all of a sudden the people mentioned to their leaders and others that we got a problem here. They're not the liberators. This is unjust. They're killing all these are people we've known for decades. This Jewish family's been in our village for 400 years. We grew up with them together. We know them well. And then when Hitler's troops started killing the Jews, they thought, wait a minute, no, we can't deal with this. Same thing, by the way, occurred in Belgium and Norway and these other countries, especially Belgium and Holland. And so they welcomed it when the British and when the Russians, I don't get it, when the Germans came in, they thought, gee, that's great. They welcomed. Maybe things would be better. They were optimistic that things would be better being controlled by Germany as opposed to their own leaders. And so, but after they started rounding up the Jews and killing them, there were so many in the countries in the area of Belgium and Netherlands and so on, so many that said, wait a minute, these are our neighbors, these are our people, these are people we've known. Why are they doing this? And so then the opposition grew against the Nazis and against Nazi Germany. Another example, there are many examples. You do a lot of reading, you just come up with hundreds of examples, and I just came up with this the other day, reading a book by a friend of mine called Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust. And he points out here in this chapter one interesting thing, which is towards the end of the war, they realized the war is winding down. The problem was Hungary was the home to some 900,000 Jews. And pretty much the Hungarian Jews were left alone in this country. And Eichmann realized that we've got to get in there and we've got to kill as many of these 900,000 as we can. Rather than spend their time and energy and bodies and bullets and so on fighting the war, no, Eichmann goes in there with his troops and they ended up murdering 450,000 Hungarian Jews. Win the war or kill the Jews? Pretty obvious. Their choice was, we need to kill the Jews. And so they put their effort into putting the Jews in boxcars and ship them to the concentration camps and killing the Jews. If they were smart, they'd draft the Jews, put them in the army, let them fight. In fact, most Jews would have fought bravely for Nazi Germany if they were drafted. And of course, during World War I, they did. The Jews had a very good record of fighting loyally for Germany in World War I. World War II, you should have done the same thing. You want land? Then fine. Then draft the Jews. They're good soldiers. They're good fighters. They're very, very loyal Germans. And so even here, draft the Jews, put uniforms on them and send them into Russia so we can conquer Russia. But no. They spent their time and money and energy shipping the Jews to concentration camps to kill them. In fact, one conflict they had towards the end of the war was that, what do we do with the boxcars? We only have so many. The troops need supplies. The Jews were shipping to concentration camps. What's more important? The supplies. The soldiers in Russia were freezing. They didn't have proper clothing. They were running out of ammunition. They were running out of food. In fact, they had to retreat because they just didn't have the supplies. They needed to stay in the same place. And so Hitler had a choice. Either send the Jews to the camps, use the train cars for that reason, or use the train cars to ship supplies to the front lines in Russia. Well, we know what they chose. They chose more important to ship the Jews from the various areas and to the concentration camps. And so basically, what's more important, winning the war or killing the Jews? Well, pretty obvious. In fact, a number of leading Nazis said, when the war is over, we will end up with medals. There'll be statues of Hitler and of the various, and Eichmann and others. There'll be statues of us because of the good thing we did, and that is reduce the population of inferior individuals. They really believe that. Today we look at that and say, what's wrong with these people? Why would they say something so appallingly stupid? Well, they didn't see this as stupid at all. They saw themselves as being heroes. And yeah, we may lose the war, but at least we've killed, well, in this case, about 6 million Jews and about 5 million Poles and Russians and other Slavic people. And so that was more important. And so that's what they focused on. So it really helps one see World War II is very different. Basically, World War II was a war between evolution, and Hitler, of course, accepted the evolutionary worldview, and creation. And in my presentation I give on this, I point out that evolution versus creation, and fortunately, creation won. And because creation won, that means basically that the Nazis were defeated and they couldn't do what they wanted to do. And so if you think about it, it really comes down in the end, creation versus evolution. Creation, of course, would say that all men are created equal and we're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We're all brothers and sisters. And therefore, the whole racist idea that Hitler had was wrong. And of course, Hitler's belief was, and his leading followers, his persons he headed the Nazi movement, they were all evolutionists, very openly evolutionists, and believe that the key is to win the war. But we have a choice. The key is we have to kill the Jews. After all, of course, Germany had a treaty with Russia. They were friends. In fact, Germany was shipping supplies to Russia for a number of years because of the treaty, or a number of months, actually, only months. But obviously that didn't hold because Hitler realized that the most important thing is to kill the Jews. And of course, we today see that as appallingly stupid. But indeed, they didn't. So they accepted a worldview which we recognize is appallingly stupid, but nonetheless, they saw this as very important. Any questions? Anything I can respond to?
Yeah, we do have some questions from the audience. So we have Solidify Your Faith is asking, will you be doing a book on the flood models, PT, CPT, and HPT?
No, I won't be, because if I did, I'm sure I would be. People would wonder, how in the world can some guy who get in Mensa be so stupid about the flood models? Well, guess what? Genius is not always effective in all areas. And my wife reminds me correctly that some things that just, how can you not know this? Well, I don't. And many of us, we specialize, and I've been researching and working on these areas for many, many years. So you can't know everything about everything. And it said if you know a lot about a lot of different areas, you fill your brain up with all kinds of ideas, and you can't really do good work. You need to specialize in, at least in some areas. But that's a good question. I just not. I guess I take the flood on faith, and I know some people want to prove everything by science, and I guess I don't see that as. I mean, I certainly encourage them to do so, and I'm very impressed with some of the work that flood geologists have done. But on the other hand, I just see all too often we have a few scriptures, a little bit of science, and a lot of speculation. And with what I'm doing, there's virtually no speculation. It's all well documented in history. And so, and the stuff I do in biology and genetics and so on, there's very little speculation. It's pretty well empirically supported.
Was there any pushback in Germany to Hitler's ideas?
Yeah, there was. I just have a new book which talked about Hitler's opposers, and there was quite a bit of, mainly from the Christian church. About a third of the Germans were very gung-ho for Hitler. Sorry, a third of the German churches were very supportive of Hitler. About a third were pretty neutral, which means basically they were in support of Hitler. So it was a third and third, two-thirds. One-third were very opposed to Adolf Hitler, of course, primarily led by the confessing church, Dr. Bonhoeffer. And so they strongly opposed. And of course, a number of them were executed because of this. But I stress this when I go out and speak. We tend to feel that we as Christians are impotent. We really can't do much. And that's tragic because, and the best example is, there's a man by the name of Martin Luther King, by the way, who was a creationist, who defended very effectively the creation worldview. We're all descendants of Adam and Eve. Therefore, we're all children of God. Therefore, we're all God's children. Therefore, racism does not exist. And he pushed that. And he also, of course, in this country, he produced a revolution before him and after him. And before him, of course, racism was unfortunately a big problem in our country. After him, we can see it's almost hard for us to understand how we would have drinking fountains, one which said colored and one which said white. You know, it's just silly. It's irresponsible. It's all the same water. We're all the same people. So we are embarrassed today with what we used to believe. But on the other hand, these beliefs were highly held. So Martin Luther King really, in many ways, changed the world. And one reason I can say that is because I'm a stamp collector. And you'd be amazed at how many stamps honor Martin Luther King? How many stamps show a picture of a white man's hand, a yellow man's hand, and a black man's hand as part of the picture? These are communist countries. These are countries which we don't see as democratic at all. And so he convinced, I would say, much of the world, not all the world, unfortunately, but much of the world, that indeed the idea of some are more evolved than others is wrong. And in many ways, he changed not just the United States, but he changed the entire world. One man, one movement. And we can do the same if we just stand up and fight for what's right. A good example is in North Dakota, there's a group of congressmen who want to basically allow schools to teach intelligent design. We need to get behind these ideas. We've got the people, we've got the movement. We have so many on the other side, so many Christians have accepted the Darwinian worldview. We have to end up, and I have a friend of mine in Finland. He said, it's a very secular country, but our main opposition in Finland comes from the church, not from the scientists. And so in many ways, what we need to focus on is converting the church. If we converted the church, everything else would be easy. And the best example I can think of is I was in Pittsburgh not too long ago. Trip was paid for, didn't cost me anything. I got my motel room and my mileage, drove to Pittsburgh, and I thought, well, I was there because I don't like to drive, as people know me. I don't like to drive, but I have no other way to get there. So when I was in Pittsburgh, I said, can you find a church I can go to and speak? Because Saturday was my appointment. Sunday was free. So rather than drive home, maybe I can go to a church and do a presentation. And he said, I don't think we're going to be able to find one. And they couldn't. One church wanted me to visit and do a presentation. Same thing when I went to Dallas. Same thing. They paid all my bills, flew there, had a place to stay. One church. On Sunday, because Saturday was the day that I presented in Dallas, I could present in a church, couldn't find one. And we're talking about Dallas. Same thing with Chicago. Every year I go to Chicago, I present in one church, and I thought, well, gee, can you find another church that would like to have me? Nope, sorry, they're not interested. And so I think the main focus we should have is on converting the church. And once we convert the church, we're in good shape. We would have far less problems if we could convince the church. And it's hard to do that. Just today, I was talking to a friend of mine. I presented at her church. She's been going there for 40 some years, and it's a Free Methodist church. And I presented there a couple of times. And I said, what's the pastor's thought? Well, he tolerates you, but I think he's an evolutionist. His son now is a college student. His son is now accepted evolution. I think he's an evolutionist. And he's not opposing. He allows you to come and speak to the group there, but he doesn't want you to speak to the whole congregation because he doesn't accept the creation worldview. And this is a Free Methodist. He's a very conservative pastor. And so over and over, if we just could reach the church, we would be in good shape. But that's difficult. Other questions?
Yes, sir. We got a few more from the audience. So we got, again, solidify your faith. I think referring to something you said earlier. Why not bash evolution? We are supposed to reprove the unfruitful works of darkness, not pay for them to be taught in government schools.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that comment greatly. And I agree. What they have done is really evil, and we should point it out. I think there are some creationists who have good friends in the evolutionary community, and they get along fairly well with the evolutionary community. And I think they don't like us to bash evolutionists because, as one person said, these are my friends. I work with these people. I like them. They like me. And therefore, I don't like people bashing these people. Well, I can understand that. I mean, but I'm not bashing any particular person. I'm just bashing a worldview, trying to show that worldview is wrong. But most people who become creationists become creationists by showing the evolution worldview is wrong. Therefore, what other choice is there? Either God created us or evolution created us. When you reject evolution created us, God created us is the main alternative. And so people accept our worldview by by rejecting evolution and accepting the case for creation. Other
Right, and
questions?
then we have one from Belinda, the comments. And she's asking, Dr. Bergman, have you written a book or research Sir Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, much? I know he came up with the term eugenics and gets a lot of credit for assessment procedures.
Oh yeah, I haven't read any of his books. I have 3 or 4 of his books. But I've read a lot about him. I've done articles about him. And he was inspired by, he said, inspired by my cousin, by Darwin. And he recognized that his development of the eugenics worldview was a result of accepting the evolutionary worldview from Charles Darwin. And so we clearly go from Darwin to eugenics to, of course, the eugenics movement, which spread throughout the world. So that's a good comment that you mentioned. It was some people say, well, let's don't blame it on Darwin. Let's blame it on Galton. Well, the problem is Galton made it very clear. I got these ideas from my cousin Charles Darwin. So when you go to the top director of these ideas, goes back to Charles Darwin.
All right, then we have Theosematique, and he's saying the main issue with Christian evolution position is that it fails to explain what Christ's resurrection actually restored. It contradicts both the account of creation in Genesis and the teaching of the church councils that there is no death before the fall. If death already existed, then what even is the fallen nature?
Excellent point, and that is a main thing that I think we should stress when we reach the churches. One reason I think I'm not invited to churches is that, well, best example is when I was teaching. I had chemistry, which I love to teach, by the way. And I had a student walk in first day of class. She walked up to me and she said, I want to tell you right now, I don't like you. I don't like this class. I don't like chemistry, period. But I have to be in here. I have to take it for my degree. So just thought I'd let you know. I never had that happen before, but I thought, oh boy, doesn't like chemistry, doesn't like me, doesn't like this class. And I thought, well, we'll see. Towards the end of the class, she made it through, did okay. And I said, well, how are things? She said, well, not nearly as bad as I thought. You explained things very well, and that really helped. So I guess my negative attitude really wasn't justified. A lot of people feel when, especially when they look at my degrees, they say, oh no, this guy's going to talk way above our heads. We're not going to be able to understand half of what he says. So why invite him? Because he's, he can't reach the ordinary person. Well, I've spent my life teaching the ordinary persons in college, and I've been in over 400 churches, many in the past. There were a lot more doors open in the past than there are today. And so I've had a lot of experience in the different churches. And not once in 400 churches did I have somebody object to what I was saying. I need to pause. Actually, once the pastor said, there's someone in this church who's an evolutionist. He doesn't agree with what you have to say, but I'm just warning you, after the presentation, he may go up to your book table and may ask you some questions. So I'm just warning you. He did. He came up to my book table, very well educated, a lawyer, smart guy. And we had the best of conversation. I'll tell you, I can say of the 400 churches I went to, our conversation was the best I have ever had in any church, anywhere, period. Excellent conversation. You could reason with him. He had a lot of questions. I helped answer his questions. And when we went home, we were out in the parking lot. And the parking lot was full, by the way, when I got there. But when we went home, there was 2 cars in the parking lot, mine and his. And so we stayed beyond everybody else, and that we had such a good conversation. And so I wish there were more people who were evolutionists who I could talk to. who could raise their questions. I love to talk to them. That's why I love teaching students, because you have students that don't agree with you and you can help them reason about what's going on. Preaching to the choir is good, but you preach to the choir, they clap, they say great job, and they go home. And so I guess as a professor, I've always liked dialogue. I'd like to deal with ideas, to interact with students relative to their thoughts and my ideas and my thoughts. And that's hard to find. I think people don't, if churches realize that, I must state churches I've been to rarely have any negative feedback. But I think before I come, there's a fear. And I've had people say, well, this guy's got all these degrees, he's a scientist. We're just ordinary people. What can he say to us? What can he help us understand? I don't think so. And my wife mentions, when she reads my articles, in the third sentence, she comes to words she doesn't understand, and she said, I'm lost. And so, of course, her background is in science. And so and I can understand that. I guess if I'm reading an article about something I have no interest or understanding about, I get turned off pretty easily and I don't read it. So at least once they invite me once, I find I'm typically invited back. But it's that one time that's difficult. They just don't want to, and they feel the sermon is for the sermon, and what we need to cover is the missionary trips with Paul, and we don't need to worry about all this science stuff and whether God created us or we evolved. And they don't realize how important it is, as some of your listeners already stated, that that's the foundation of Christianity. There's no sin, there's no Adam and Eve, there's no sin, there's no forgiveness, there's no sacrifice. The whole thing is based on Adam and Eve's sin. And so from a Christian standpoint, the creation of Adam and Eve is the core.
Tell us about your book, Hitler and the Darwinian Worldview.
Oh, okay. I forgot to bring that among all my books, but yeah, Hitler, the Darwinian Worldview is an interesting book because normally I work on books for years. Some of the books I'm just finishing now, I've been in the fire for 2, 3, 4. One book, my Darwin book, I spent years on that. But the Hitler book, I decided to write it, did the research, probably 6 months, wrote the manuscript, sent it in, it was published. And that is the best selling book I've ever published. There must be 30,000 copies on there. And so that was very, very successful. In fact, all too often when I go and speak, if I run out of a book, that's the book I run out of. It's very, very popular. I've asked people, why is that so popular? I said, well, a lot of us are German. Many of my readers are German background. And just a lot of interest in Hitler, I guess, because World War II affected so many people. And the people I usually talk to at the churches I attend, well, my grandfather was in World War II, or my uncle was in World War II. And so they're aware of it. So there's a fascination, I think, with Hitler, and therefore, and it's very readable. I haven't had anyone say, gee, I can't read it. It's a very readable book and very succinct. And I show it basically that all of Hitler's leading men, I call them his disciples, but that's the words people don't like to use, but all of his leading Nazis were all Darwinists. And I show that every one of them accepted the Darwinian worldview. And that was an important part in their contributing to the movement. So.
All right, then we have a question from Sharon. I am curious where you found instances recorded of people welcoming invaders into their countries in World War II. I have not heard of this.
That's a good point. Look at the early part of when the Hitler men invaded, I'm pretty sure, Denmark and Belgium as well, especially Netherlands. And there's a fair number written about this. So if you look in any book which talks about the early part of the war, you'll see where they talk about whether they could bring good thing. One reason they thought that good things would be coming because the economy in Germany was good. There was hardly any unemployment, wages were good, and some of these countries, like the Dutch area, employment was a problem. And so they thought, well, Germany takes over, they'll give us jobs, they'll bring money in, they'll improve our economy. And so people were at first very optimistic as to what the invaders could do or going to do. And the same thing in Nazi Germany. I don't have any reference right on top of me, but you read a lot about the war. I try to read at least 3 or 4 books a year on World War II. I've been doing this for 40 years. So I read a huge amount. And even some of the films, there's a lot of really good films which talk about World War II. In fact, there is one film which specifically covers the Dutch experience in World War II, and it brings this out. And so if you look probably on Amazon on World War II, the Dutch experience, you'll find not only books, but also films which point this out. But that's a good question. I appreciate that. It sounds so counterproductive since we know how evil the Nazis became. On the other hand, one thing that Hitler stressed in Britain, especially when we conquer Britain, what we need to do is treat them well. In fact, in one area, they said, you go to the store, you pay them the money. You don't take anything from any of the stores. You treat them like your guests, and you treat them well, respectedly. So they realize if they end up with all these, riots against them, they realize that'd be a problem. So many of the people were told, you treat them with respect, you don't take advantage of them. We are guests in their country. We don't want a revolution. We want to accept them to accept us, and we will accept them. And then later on, of course, once you have control of the country, then you can start, behaving less civilly. There's a lot of good films, by the way, I bet I have a stack of films, World War II, probably 12 feet high, a stack of DVDs. There's a huge amount of stuff. A lot of repetition, but a lot of really good stuff on World War II. What I do is every night before I go to bed, I spend an hour and a half watching a video. And so I've watched, 400 hours a year. Past 30 years, I've watched thousands of hours of videos. And one area I concentrated on was World War II. It's hard to read a book for 6, 7, 8 hours a day. So, and now much of the reading I do is for my writing. And so I watch a lot of videos. Tonight I'll watch one. I'm watching one on FDR. And watched earlier one on Roosevelt. On Woodrow Wilson. So normally I don't read books on FDR or Woodrow Wilson. But watching the film, you get a lot of information in a short period of time. And I've gained a lot of insight into World War II by watching films about our leaders and what they wanted to do and why. For example, Woodrow Wilson made it very clear, and they quote from his writings, that the Treaty of Versailles is going to fail. And he said very perceptively, this war is going to continue. It will be a greater war. And World War I will look like you're playing with a bunch of kids' toys. That's what he said. World War II will be far greater than World War I. We need to be able to adequately deal with the issues, and we're not. He had these 14 points that he listed. And the 14 points were important in order to end the war. And he said most of these were rejected